over time, such as issue agenda that might change the patterns of which groups are approaching you or you're approaching them to meet with and work with?
I think most, like, fairly sophisticated stakeholders know that they have to, especially in the Senate, like, talk to both sides, because otherwise it's, like, pretty hard to get things over the finish line.
Yeah.
So, like, for that reason alone, I think that, there's probably not too much of a difference. But there is a difference, right? Like, it is better to be in the majority. And, like, the specific reason that it's better is because you get to set the agenda exactly as you set it, right? Like, you get to determine, like, what the hearings are going to be on, how often those hearings are, like, what bills are going to be included in a markup and which aren't, what, like, the sort of, like, processes are going to get followed for getting those bills marked up. And people know that. So, I do think that, as much as, like, we probably don't see too much of a difference in terms of, like, who comes to talk to us about stuff that they're worried about. I think, like, everybody is obviously aware that, like, it's up to the Republicans to set the agenda for the committee, and I assume that their advocacy reflects that.
Yeah. Okay. So this is moving a little bit away towards thinking about Congress and the White House.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of related to this is a follow-up question.
Yeah.
The types of groups that approach your committee,
mm-hmm.
do they tend to be groups that are supportive of the types of things that Democrats in the committee are trying to do? Are they opposed to things that Democrats in the committee are trying to do? Basically, do the groups that approach you, are they groups that are supportive of what you're trying to do or opposed to what you're trying to do? And that probably feeds into the answer you just gave, where sophisticated groups are trying to talk to both sides all the time.
Yeah.
But I guess, in general, is there one type of group versus the other that tends to try to interact with you more?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some stakeholders that presumably spend a lot of time talking to us and don't spend a lot of time talking to Republicans and vice versa. But those probably fall more into the, like, think tank kind of world. So to the extent that, like, I assume, like, Center for American Progress or, like, Families USA or folks like that probably spend a lot less time talking to the Republicans, and maybe not much at all. The same way that, like, Heritage and, like, the American Enterprise Institute don't spend very much time talking to us.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, to that extent, like, organizations that have, like, an explicitly ideological flavor probably just talk to the people that are on their side of the issues. But if you're talking more about, like, industry and consumer groups, so, like, patient organizations, I mean, to some extent, Families is a patient organization more than a think tank, but, anyways, I mean, like, disease groups, associations of different types of, like, providers, be they, like, nurses or doctors or, physician specialty societies, whomever, hospitals, the insurance companies, prescription drug manufacturers, that they generally speak to both sides, because I think they, like, acknowledge that, like, whatever it is that they need to accomplish, they need to do it with the support of both sides in the Senate.
Do you notice either groups that are aligned or not aligned with the goals that the Democratic members in your committee might have, that they try to reach out and make contact and interact with you more at different stages of the legislative process, or is it fairly consistent across? So I guess, like, do you notice that either groups that are opposed or supportive of your agenda, that they might be more communicative with you before legislation is proposed or when legislation is proposed, versus when it comes time for markup or when a bill is getting ready to move out of committee to the floor?
So that's interesting. I don't know that I would, like, categorize it as much in the vein of supportive or opposed, as much as, like, kind of, like, level of, like, sophistication,
okay,
like, how Congress works. So I think, like, oftentimes the, like, more sophisticated organizations either have a pre-existing relationship with the like, office and the staff because they've, like, worked together on other issues, or they like recognize that they're sort of like newer in the space, and so like oftentimes like those types of folks, like say like a newer drug company or something like that, or like a newer patient organization that's just forming, will come and do like introductory meetings, like just to like talk about like what it is that they're doing without like a specific policy like ask, so to speak, or policy position, and then we'll sort of like follow up from there. So I do think that there are like like different types of meetings that stakeholders will ask for, in terms of like introductory ones versus ones where like they have like a very specific thing that they want or need. And then, sometimes there are folks who are a bit less sophisticated who will come in very late in the process, with like a very specific want or need, not having, kind of like done the groundwork of like making sure everyone understands like who they are, what they need, what they, what's their value in the healthcare system. So I think there's sort of like a distinction there as much as like oppose or support.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you talk about groups with varying levels of sophistication, when you think of that, what do you think of as the marks of whether a group is more sophisticated in its advocacy strategy versus?
I think it's about understanding the like process, and that I think comes with like kind of like formal and informal knowledge, probably like formalized knowledge of understanding like, okay, like, markup has been publicly posted. I'm going to need to like get in touch with somebody before that, not afterwards. It's easier to make changes sort of before a committee has marked up something up as compared to like trying to make changes like on the floor, when, like the opinions of like all 100 senators are at play as compared to like just like a smaller subset. And then sort of like more informal stuff of like, also understanding like how many days before the markup happens, like will people have like actually sort of like put pens down, or, they've put pens down on big new ideas versus like small tweaks, right? So like if somebody comes in with like a whole new idea, like, hey, I want to add like a whole new grant program to a bill or something like that, and, they're talking about it like, only a few days before a markup, like that would be a case where that, that would be pretty unlikely to happen because like people's bandwidth has sufficiently shrunk to like, dotting I's and crossing T's.
Right.
Whereas like, if somebody comes in and says like, hey, there's just some small tweaks to the language, like the formula that the grant uses, or like, what kind of entity is eligible to receive funding under the grant, or something like that, that's something where like change is going to happen later on in the process, and having an informal understanding of like just like how long it takes to do stuff, gives people sort of like easier or more difficult policy asks to like actually like say yes to if there's something that the committee agrees with.
Do you think the level of sophistication of groups varies across types of groups, or do you so industry versus patient advocacy versus other stakeholders?
Yeah, there's a lot of like patient advocacy groups that are really, really good at this. So I'm not sure that it's and from time to time there are like folks from industry who are new to the space and like don't have a high level of sophistication. So by and large, I mean I think that you kind of get a mix of both. Of like sophisticated and unsophisticated industry groups, and the same on the patient side. Okay. Yeah, at least in my experience.
Okay. When the committee wants to reach out to groups to either solicit testimony at hearings or to collaborate or get their opinions on legislation or proposed changes to legislation, are there kind of go-to groups that are always the ones that you would reach out to first, or if not, what helps inform your decision about which groups you reach out to?
We generally do try and cast a pretty broad net. I mean, like, I think, obviously, like, people have sort of, like, trusted relationships with people who they see as, like, particularly impartial or as being particularly expert. And, like, obviously, like, draw a lot on those, sort of trusted relationships. But there's also, like, the risk in those cases of sort of getting, like, a bit of tunnel vision. And so you do need to sort of, like, supplement feedback from, like, trusted organizations or people with, like, trying to cast a pretty broad net. In terms of, like, legislation versus, like, testimony in an actual hearing setting, I would almost view those as sort of, like, separate things. I think, you know, hearings are like an important way for gathering information, but they're also like an important way of like